to say hello to everyone and welcome to WFGR's 2021. My name is Sky Greenware. I'm a PhD student in the firm department and the leader of this year's WFGR's, the Western Forestry Graduate Research Symposium Organizing Committee. So we're really glad to have so many people here at the start of our day of virtual talks, kind of celebrating grad student research in the College of Forestry, as well as kind of beyond the College of Forestry in connected disciplines. And it's my honor to introduce and pass the mic off to Tom DeLuca, who's the Dean of the College of Forestry, who's going to kick things off with an introduction to the day and to our theme for this year, which is regenerate, and then introduce our keynote speaker. So Tom, thanks so much for being here today and for your support. I'm going to pass things off to you.
Great, thank you, Sky, and welcome everybody to the 2021 Western Forestry Graduate Student Symposium. I have participated in these at the University of Montana and at the University of Washington previously, and I just love these events, and it's such an important opportunity for our grad students to share their work, and it really sets a great example for the college, and that tells us something that we should be doing as faculty and staff as well, engaging together like this. The graduate students set a really nice example in that regard. So, but anyhow, I wish we were together in person rather than doing this virtually, but hey, it's just part of this process that we've been going through over the last over a year now. But let me start off by just saying that I'm really impressed with the lineup of talks for today, and it really reflects the wide diversity of interests and disciplines that are at play here in the college. Everything from invasive species to silviculture to student experiences to operations, economics, forest soils, human dimensions, wood quality, forest ecology, genetics, CRISPR manipulations, just really super impressive. I mean, this is our college, you know, and it shows the diversity of what is required to address issues of sustainability, and integrating across those disciplines is so key, and that's what we're doing today. And regenerate is such a great theme for this conference. And why? Well, partly because we may feel the need to regenerate after this extremely strange last year, in which we felt like we had to consume twice as much energy to work against entropy. And entropy, according to the second law of thermodynamics, states that any use of energy or action leads to some creation of disorder, and that disorder takes energy to create order. And if I could use a soils example just for a moment, sorry. Soils are hugely representative of a system regenerated from chaos. If we think about it, geologic material, crystals and rock and strata are slowly degraded and decomposed and reshuffled and deposited over time as somewhat of a chaotic, unstructured mass, say in a floodplain. And our, plant life, taking energy from the sun, just pour energy below ground and slowly restructure that material into aggregates and horizons. And it's really important to think about it. From plants deliver between 20 and 40% of their photosynthate below ground, and it's not by accident. They're creating order within this disorder or this chaos below ground to create a system that is functional for the plant community and animal community that exists in it, microbial community, and for that which is on which we are so reliant. With regard to the college, we're recovering from the chaos introduced by COVID. Students and faculty showed an amazing amount of resilience over the last year, adapting to the COVID, but at the same time, it's had real and lasting impacts, whether straining our ability to do field work or laboratory work. It's going to require and has required energy, collective and individual, to rebuild and regenerate the power of the educational system in which we work. So again, regenerate is such a good theme for this conference or symposium. We also experienced one of the most remarkable wildfire seasons in Oregon's history. So it's really appropriate. We have Crystal here to talk to us about fire just shortly. The hot, dry conditions and east-west winds that exist on Labor Day weekend pushed forward a torrent fire in multiple locations across the asbestos forests of Western Cascades, and over 1 million acres burned in Oregon alone. And houses, homes, property, people's lives were destroyed. And Meg Krawchuk summed it up really beautifully, and I won't say it the way she did, which was basically the fires are not unprecedented. They fit within the realm of historic norms across the, these low frequency, high severity systems of the West Cascades. But it was that intersection of climate change, social systems, past management, and fire regimes that created the conditions of chaos. And nature seeks to regenerate after fire, and we seek to regenerate our communities. And in both cases, we're going to need to do so in a manner that is resilient and takes into account the changing climate to achieve true resilience moving forward. I could go on about the strange last year or strange several years, and we would have to once again consider the chaos and the strain created by the energy that the strain created by the gross exposure of social injustice throughout our country. And once again, the need to invest energy, social and physical, to regenerate a social and judicial system that needs to be much more just, equitable, and inclusive. So that's enough for me. I just really, this is really all about you, and I'm really excited once again to see the diversity of work that's being presented here. And I'm really happy to introduce our keynote speaker now, Crystal Kolden, who's at the University of California at Merced, who will be talking on rethinking how we measure wildfires, putting the 2020 fire season in context, which is so appropriate for this conference. Just briefly, Dr. Kolden is a pyrogeographer in the management of complex systems at the University of California, Merced. And she's a former wildland firefighter. She holds a doctorate degree in geography from Clark University, an MS in geography from University of Nevada, Reno, and her AB, cum laude, mind you, is from Cornell University. She was previously a faculty member at the University of Idaho and served as a research scientist for both the US Forest Service in California and US Geological Survey in Alaska prior to her academic career. Let's see. She conducts research on reducing vulnerability to wildfire disasters globally through improved understanding of coupled human environmental drivers. We're really, really fortunate to have Dr. Kolden with us here today to share both her practical experience as well as her scholarly perspective on rethinking how we measure wildfires. And with that, Crystal, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was a really generous introduction, and thank you all so much for inviting me. It's just a year delayed because of the pandemic, but I am so grateful for the opportunity to speak to all of you who are doing the amazing work and becoming the next generation of scholars that are going to tackle these increasingly complex problems in Western forested systems. And I will share my screen here. Great to see so many familiar faces this morning. All right. Ooh, there we go. So as Tom mentioned, I am now at the University of California, Merced. I was previously at the University of Idaho for 10 years, and I have been working on wildfire for over 20 years now. I was just thinking this morning about how 22 years ago was when I really started getting into fire and forestry. And I have been thinking a lot about disasters, and the evolution of my career has been a winding one. across a multitude of silos and different topic ideas, but really where it's moving towards is understanding how we mitigate wildfire disasters. And 2020 was sort of this perfect storm of conditions that facilitated large and impactful wildfire events. And across the Western US, of course, it was a very dry, hot year, particularly across the Southwest and up into Oregon and Washington. And the metric that is often used by climatologists who work on fire-climate relationships is vapor pressure deficit. And it's that measure of how dry the air is. And so we had enormous vapor pressure deficit record in a lot of the Southwestern US over the course of the summer. In 2020, we also had really incredible events, right? They were not unprecedented, as Tom noted, but definitely infrequent, right? And so we had lightning storms in the San Francisco Bay Area that ignited fires that ultimately burned extensive areas and large numbers of homes and shut down freeways and things like that. Lightning is pretty rare, especially dry lightning in the San Francisco Bay Area. We had incredible east wind events, not just in Oregon, but also in California and Washington and other parts of the West where those dry, high impact east winds drove fire down mountainsides through katabatic effects. And of course, we had the legacy of our forest management practices and the droughts that have impacted huge areas of the West, the bark beetle attacks that have impacted huge areas of the West and made these forests highly vulnerable to the types of fire behavior that we saw this summer. And finally, we had COVID, which really was a game changer in very specific ways, including increased numbers of people recreating in and utilizing our public lands. Oftentimes in some parts of the country, people who were not really familiar with being out in the forest and may have made some not so great choices because they didn't recognize how dry conditions were. They didn't have those slides of what normal is. And we also had issues with fire suppression being impacted by COVID and worries about outbreaks in fire camps and things like that. So it was really this perfect storm in 2020. And what that ended up producing were some fascinating statistics, right? Record area burned, at least in the contemporary record in California, Colorado, and Oregon. In California, the August complex burned over 400,000 hectares, which the media promptly dubbed the first gigafire since it was over 1 million acres. We had the top 3 largest fires ever in the state of Colorado, 2 of which burned relatively late in the season, over 4 million hectares across the US in entirety. And in a year when Alaska didn't burn very much, that was absolutely a record for the lower 48. At least 47 fatalities and over 18,000 structures were destroyed. And then of course, the other big impact was smoke up and down the Western US for long periods of time, really impacting quality of life. And this is really consistent with a lot of the trends that we've seen lately, right? So when we look at wildfire trends over time, and particularly in recent decades, what we have is this increase in area burned, and John Abotskloo and Park Williams have attributed part of this increase, and in fact, about half of the increase associated with anthropogenic climate change, right? So really we have a doubling of area burned over the last 35 years, specifically associated with human-caused climate change, right? So this is consistent. But the question that I want to ask is, was 2020 really a disaster? Right? And how do we answer that question as scientists? Because, Meg Krawczyk is one of my colleagues who I am constantly reminded is a fantastic way with words. So Tom's paraphrasing of her words was better than this in many ways. But a disaster it's really a human construct, right? It's based on our value systems. Even though we call it a natural disaster, it is based on what we as humans lose. And so when we look at mitigation, and as we try and identify what mitigation actions we can take to become resilient resilient, we're really thinking about human value systems. And in geography and disaster geography, there has been identified this sort of triangle in a resilience framework, which it's basically identifies that there are three legs of this triangle, or three corners of this triangle that allow for disturbance and characterize the magnitude of that disturbance, right? And those are exposure, which is just the event itself, the sensitivity of populations that are exposed to that disaster or that event, and then the adaptive capacity of those populations to be resilient, right? And we see this every year with a whole magnitude of different disasters, that some populations are better able to mitigate ahead of time and better able to rebound quickly, and other populations are not, right? And that is really a measure of their resilience. And it's important to understand these because it helps us identify the types of mitigation actions we can take. Wildfire science has always had a fascination with size, and this is why we talk about trends in wildfire being towards greater, right? So when we look at the past 30 years, what we see is this increasing trend in area burned. And this is most often what you see is this relatively recent time series. However, when we look at long-term time series, which are imperfect in many ways, and the National Interagency Fire Center always cautions people with a lot of these older data sets and their caveats. But what we do see, and what is supported by the dendrochronology literature and other types of archaeological literature, is that prior to the 1950s, we had substantially more fire in the US. And that, there are estimates that in the late 20s and 30s, when there was another Western hot, dry decade, that it was not uncommon to have 40, 50 million acres of fire a year in the US, right? And so it really puts in perspective our increasing trends today. But we have this obsession with size that has informed how wildfire science has evolved. And the Missoula Fire Lab was the first fire lab in the country with the Forest Service that really started to ask questions of, okay, well, how do we deal with these fires, right? And what they really asked was, how do we prevent or extinguish fires as quickly and safely as possible? And this really stems initially from the 1910 fires in Idaho and Montana, colloquially known as the Big Burn. 3 million acres, 85 people ultimately perished in those fires, right? And it was a national catastrophe. And the Forest Service took that event and ran with it because it was fledgling at the time. It had very little funding and made fire suppression its mission. And so the science followed that, right? How do we stop this sort of event from happening, where not only do we have fatalities, we have massive losses of highly valuable Western timber. And this is Western white pine in Idaho, which is incredibly valuable to the timber industry. So, the Fire Science Lab put together a whole bunch of experiments and came up with some equations for how fire burns and how we can actually characterize fire danger, so that we could better understand, all right, how do we stop these things? The problem, of course, as we have better understood over the decades, is that we don't want to stop them. We shouldn't stop fires, right? Because over 80% of the terrestrial surface globally is actually fire evolved, right? And many of these biomes not only have a lot of fire frequently, but they need it to continue their ecosystem processes in a resilient, healthy way. And in the US, this is very clear, right? I often say, when people ask me, where's the highest fire danger in the US? I say, well, the better question is, where is there no fire danger? And let me point you to some deserts and some lakes. And that's about it. Everywhere else we have fire danger. It is just the timing and the conditions, right? So yeah, in Western Oregon, it is not unprecedented to have large fires. There was a whole spate of them in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it is in longer records and some of the work that's been done up on the and I've just blanked on the name, the watershed for the city of Portland that I can't remember for the life of me. Anyway, it's you know, some of the studies that were done in there by Jim Agee at University of Washington show that there was a whole series of fire in the 1600s, right? Large stand replacing fires that were recorded on the trees that didn't burn, right? So we've got fire everywhere. And this is also true when we look at fire disasters historically. It's not just a Western US problem. It's not just a California problem. It is a process that occurs nationally at different intervals under different types of conditions with different fire behavior. And it's really just a function of what the conditions are of both the fuels and the climate. So I got interested in this about 10 years ago. I started looking at remotely sensed data. That's not true, actually. It's probably about 15 years ago. I did my doctoral work on remote sensing of fire and specifically on burn severity. And one of the things that I saw when I started looking at maps of burn severity was that there were a lot of areas that didn't burn in perimeters. And this goes against sort of the way we represent fire in maps, where we have this polygon and it's homogeneous within the polygon that everything burned. And of course, when you get out on the land and walk it, that's not what you see at all. You see a lot of trees that didn't burn, right? And there's pockets of resilience all over burned landscapes, like this pocket of trees in Yosemite National Park. And these we have sort of continued to call fire refugia, right? And it doesn't matter what ecosystem they're in, all over the place, what we see are that there are these pockets of resilience. And that even in the most sort of severe types of fires. This is the 2013 Rim Fire in California, which when it burned was well outside the historical range of variability for the amount of high severity fire on this. And you know what people sort of saw in the news and on the media reports was the areas in red, which were these vast pockets of high severity, and which were very much outside the norm for this forest type. But what's really amazing is that despite the fact that this was an incredibly high severity fire that was outside the range of variability historically, we still had huge pockets of resilience in the green, which is unburned, and then the yellow, which is lower severity. So these fire refugia are everywhere. And it got me thinking a lot about how we characterize fires, because we tend to characterize a fire as a single unit, and we say it's good or it's bad. But ecologically, and from a human environment perspective, that doesn't make any sense, because these fires are highly heterogeneous, both in how they burn and in how they actually impact the landscape and what's on it. So I started getting into this research on fire refugia, and published a paper that we looked at 3 national parks in Canada, Montana, and California, and said, okay, well, you know, these fire refugia, are they related at all to the size of these fires? Like, is a more severe fire going to have less fire refugia? And it turned out that there wasn't a good relationship between area burned and the proportion of fire refugia across that area, that firescape. And so then we put together a data set for the entire Northwest. So Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And my postdoc, Ari Medens, who's now an assistant professor at Washington State, worked on this with me. And basically what we found was that even during our largest fire seasons, we have consistent proportions of these unburned islands or these fire refugia within these polygons, right? And that says that there are parts of these landscapes that are always going to be resilient, even within these, you know, these severe fire events, right? And those are not bad. So how does that feed into asking this larger question? Okay, how do we better characterize fires, right? And I think the answer is that it's not size. Size is a horrible indicator of whether or not a fire is disastrous, because there are always portions of these fires that are resilient, that are having healthy fire in them. And in fact, the other thing that I started to ask was, okay, well, are our biggest fires the most destructive ones? And it turns out that's not true either. because when we look at some of the most destructive fires in the history of the United States, or at least in the last 100 years, because that's what we actually have good records for, some of our smallest fires have been really destructive. This is the 1933 Griffith Park fire right outside of Los Angeles. It was only 47 acres, but 29 men were killed on this fire. It's tiny, right? That's absolutely nothing. And even one of the more destructive fires of the 20th century, the 1991 Oakland Hills, or commonly called the Tunnel Fire, it was only 1,500 acres, and yet almost 3,000 homes were burned in this event, and 25 people were killed, right? So highly destructive event on a very, very small fire. And this is ongoing work trying to ask this question about size, but over and over, what I'm seeing is that size is a horrible indicator of how disastrous a fire is. And this was really brought home for me when I was on sabbatical in 2019 in Australia, because Tasmania is the island off the southeast coast of Australia, and I spent my sabbatical there. And the joke was that I picked my sabbatical year a couple years before, and the year I showed up, they had a really intense fire season. It happened to be a very dry, hot summer. They had almost all of their fires are lightning ignited, so they had a massive dry lightning event in mid-January that had about 3,300 dry lightning strikes in one day, and ultimately, they had a fire season that year, which was the second largest on record for them. And they had over 200,000 hectares burnt. That's 3% of the island of Tasmania, right? And it was a major season for them. It went 2 months, well, 3 if you count the early starts in December, but they didn't have any fatalities. They didn't have very much in terms of the way of structural loss. They just had 7 homes consumed, and most of them were secondary structures, these little vacation cabins that they have out in the bush. And the smoke exposure was actually relatively moderate. Most of the smoke did not impact the major urban areas, and it cost about 50 million Australian dollars to suppress. Well, the Tasmanians, while I was there, sort of found out that there was this American fire scientist and said, "Oh my goodness, well, what do you make of this? Isn't this horrible? Isn't this a disaster?" And I started looking at the numbers and said, I know it feels like it, but I don't actually think it's as much of a disaster as you think it is. And one of the things the Tasmanians were particularly concerned about were these very special paleoendemic plants, and they're relics of the Gondwanan era, when Australia was still attached to the rest of the Southeast Asian subcontinent. And basically, as it moved away, these relics persisted, and now they only persist in Tasmania. And they're a big part of their cultural identification and their identity, right? And so they're really worried about them. 2/3 of Tasmania is a wilderness, and it's a World Heritage Area. And so we said, okay, well, let's see how many of these really important ecological areas burned in these fires. And so we said, okay, here's these fire perimeters, and the pink is where these paleoendemic pines are. And in little tiny yellow dots in a couple places is where the fires actually burnt these paleoendemics that were of really critical importance, right? So in one area, there was essentially nothing burnt. And in fact, on the eastern side of this fire, as the fire moved into where the paleoendemics were, they're basically like a rainforest, and the fire just died when it got to the paleoendemics, right? It was too wet for it to burn, even under the hottest, driest conditions. We said, okay, well, they're fine there, right? Everything else was eucalyptus and stuff that's fire evolved and won't get killed by this. It just comes back. And similarly, on the Reveau Road fire, which is south of Hobart, there was just a few acres. I think it was only about 20 hectares that burned of these paleoendemic pines that were so critical because once they burn, they don't come back. They're not fire adapted at all. So we said, okay, yeah, I know these fires were huge, but you didn't lose lives. You lost very few shacks, and you didn't lose the thing that is so critical to you, which is this ecological system that won't come back after fire. So, I know it's hard, but you have to also think of this as maybe we just got a lot of fire that we were due for that is actually not going to impact this eucalyptus ecosystem because it's fire evolved. And now we're seeing regeneration of this areas. And in fact, just a few weeks after these fires, they were already seeing regeneration of the fire adapted species across huge swaths. And what was interesting, of course, is that then a year later, the Australian bushfires happened, right? Just about a year and a half ago now. And it really, I think, helped for the Tasmanians to put their fire season in better perspective, because they did not have the mass evacuations and the fatalities and the home loss and the sort of the massive disaster that befell mainland Australia in the winter of 19 and 20. So, what I started to ask is, okay, size is not a good indicator of disasters. And we know from 100 years of trying to prevent fires, failing, and actually making things worse, why are we still trying to prevent fires in order to prevent disasters? Because we are. In this week in California, there's been a whole to-do because our governor decided to allocate another $500 million to fire services. And while they made small nods to sort of fuels treatment and things like that, overwhelmingly, the message that came through in the governor's new fire budget is we need to do a better job of preventing fires, because that will prevent disasters. So it is plainly in the political language and in the budgetary and fiscal support, right, that we want to prevent fires to prevent disasters. But that is not what the science supports at all, right? Our obsession with size asserts that more fire is bad. But when we work in fire ecology and forestry and ancillary ecological fields that are fire adapted, we know that's not true. Fire is a process that has good ecological outcomes at all. So how do we get past this obstacle? Why do we actually need to convey this nuance? Well, there's a lot of reasons that we need to address this question and convey the nuance, right? One is that fire happens everywhere, right? And in the US, it's not even a big part of our system. The places in the globe where there is the most fire are in these subtropical regions where fire is just a part of life. It's used to burn the land, to regenerate forage for range animals and cattle. It's used to clear farmland in a lot of places. And it is used by Indigenous people in a lot of Northern Australia, where there's that big red glop. That is Aboriginal burning that has been going on for millennia. And it is really just a profound ecosystem process over so much of the globe, right? We are not going to be able to stop this, right? There's no point in trying to prevent fire or even minimize fire. And we know that, in fact, we need more fire in a lot of places that are fire adapted. This is longleaf pine forest in the southeastern US, where prescribed fire and fire in general were removed for about 5 decades after the Civil War. And in the 1930s, ecologists and particularly wildlife biologists figured out that, hey, actually, the longleaf pine forest needs fire. And now it is a common process. The southeastern US does about 5 million acres or 2 million hectares of prescribed fire every single year, with a huge chunk of it going to support longleaf pine forests and their associated ecosystems. In the West, we know this is true as well, and we aren't doing a good job with it, right? As we have to overcome this legacy of fire suppression. We have ample evidence that 100 years ago or 200 years ago, there was a lower density of trees across huge swaths of our Western forest. There were large patches of recently burned areas. There was this mosaic, this massive heterogeneity. And Paul Hesberg at the Forest Service up in Wenatchee has done an enormous amount of work on this, showing that, yeah, there used to be a lot of areas that burned frequently, and even on the west side, stand replacing fires that left these patches, these mosaics. And where we have suppressed that fire, we've got unhealthy forests that, in the bottom right picture, are now actually susceptible to drought and beetle kill because they have lost their resilience from also losing fire. Right. And we have species that we know are fire dependent, right? These are the giant sequoia of California, which for many years, the National Park Service in California couldn't figure out why they couldn't get any baby sequoias to grow. They had all these old ones, but no nurseries. And finally, they figured out, oh, sequoia need fire, right? So they started reintroducing fire in the Sierra Nevada and found that their sequoia actually started to grow. So I want to take you through a quick journey of the 2020 fires to sort of start getting at this question of, all right, how do we stop talking about size and start talking about impacts so that we can better mitigate and adapt to fire as humans and prevent these disasters? A good example to start with is in the east side on the Green Ridge Fire, which burned last August on the Deschutes National Forest. So this is just northwest of Bend and Sisters, Oregon. This is only about 1,500 hectares, right? It's a relatively small fire. It was entirely wind driven. You can see in this outline that it started here on the west side and then moved to the east under a little east side wind driven downslope event. And it was of particular interest to me because some of you may know that Bevelaw had for the last 20 years an Ameriflux tower on a site that ended up being within the perimeter of this fire. And so they've been measuring carbon flux at this Ameriflux tower for 20 years. And this tower burned this year. And one of my colleagues at the University of Idaho, Dr. Tara Hudeberg, did her doctoral work at OSU on this tower. And she didn't really know very much about fire, but she called me one day and said, hey, I think our tower is going to burn. And so we started looking at it. And it was interesting because our reactions were very different. She was very concerned that the tower was going to burn and they were going to lose everything. And I said, oh my gosh, what a great experiment we'll have. This is fantastic. The tower's going to burn. And so we watched it and then we went out afterwards, and it was really interesting because, again, the fire effects were highly heterogeneous, right? There were some areas where we had high severity crown fire that torched out the trees, and then there were still a lot of green trees that only had low severity fire underneath. This is really common with wind-driven fires, that you get these runs. And what it looked like as it was coming up to the tower before they lost the power supply because the batteries all burned and the cables all burned, this was generally a creeping fire, and then it torched up and ran a little bit in a couple places. And you can see, and I think this is called Black Butte is what the name of the peak is there. You can see that there are fingers, right? So this was a wind-driven finger that ran through and torched out these trees. There's a lot of scorch in here. They actually dropped a layer of retardant, which didn't do a heck of a lot, which is pretty common in conifer forests. Retardant's pretty useless under really dry conditions and multi-layered canopies. So highly heterogeneous, and then huge patches of green. Right. So we have an experiment going there now, because what we found was that when we went out and surveyed over 1,600 trees, the initial set was only 890, and then we added quite a few more. But ultimately, our percentage of trees that remained green after the fire was over 30%, right? And so we set up this experiment there that is going to, because they're replacing the tower. And the site is it's a private landowner. It's 80-year-old Ponderosa dominated stand. This was a small fire. No fatalities, no structures consumed. There was some evacuations of a local camp there. It cost about $10 million to suppress. And really, this is just a priceless scientific experiment that we'll be able to run now, where we are going to be able over time to measure changes in net primary productivity and carbon post-fire. They've now salvage logged part of this site, and so there'll be an opportunity to look at how, as replanting happens, that impacts the site as well. And they left some trees that we are measuring sap flow on to look at when trees die, because one of the things we still don't know is how fire kills trees. We have no idea, especially not in the field. So we're measuring sap flow. So this is one example of breaking down a fire and saying, okay, there were some things, yes, it cost a lot to put out that fire. Obviously, the tower was harmed and we have to replace it, but there were really a lot of positives as well. This is a site that was fire adapted. A lot of those trees will survive, and it will be reseeded both naturally and by the landowner, and be potentially just an incredibly valuable research site going forward. And so when we think about Oregon in general, for many of you, this was potentially a really traumatic fire season to live through. For some of you, you may have had to deal with family or lands that were impacted, or be evacuated yourself, or you felt the impacts of smoke, right? And so it's hard to sort of separate that personal trauma from looking at how these fires burned. But it is important to really understand the characteristics and the nuances, right? So instead of saying, oh, okay, well, we had this many fires and this many hectares that were destroyed, as the media likes to put it, right? Over 6,000 structures, 11 fatalities, right? Obviously, those are disastrous parts, right? And for the people whose lives were lost, that can never be repaired. It is also really important to understand where those specifically occurred so that we can mitigate those specific disaster outcomes in the future, right? So we need to understand what specifically was destroyed, right? Where were those homes destroyed? Where were those lives lost? And why? Were they lost sitting in their homes, or were they evacuating on roads that were really difficult to navigate, right? That's a big difference in terms of understanding so that we can better mitigate. The Detroit water treatment plant was destroyed, right? That has potential massive implications because of the requirements of the Clean Water Act, and the need for people to have clean water so that we don't have outbreaks of typhoid and dysentery, right? Which can kill a lot more people than the initial fire. And obviously there's some refugee challenges where we've got over 1,000 people that were in long-term shelters. Some people still are in long-term temporary housing in parts of Oregon and California as well. And then we have hazardous air quality that impacted huge numbers of people in the state, right? And that is something that can be mitigated. And what we saw was sort of real-time attempts to mitigate smoke through simple fixes like putting certain MERV 13 filters over box fans in your window, right? Because a lot of people in Oregon don't have air conditioning to filter this stuff out. So focusing on the things that were negative impacts helps to identify those mitigation strategies. Meanwhile, for those who are more interested in the ecology, right, and what it did to the forests, it's important to realize that most of the destruction actually occurred on less than 10% of the total burned area, right? And about 40,000 hectares of fire occurred on the dry east side of the Cascades, right? Which is supposed to have fire, right? That's a 5 to 30-year fire return interval. Meanwhile, about 140,000 hectares of fire occurred on the wet west side, the asbestos forest, right? Which has a very long fire return interval. But again, this is really patchy burn severity. And was it bad fire just because it happened or because it was stand replacing? I would say no, right? The bad outcome is how it impacted people, potential for water supplies to be impacted, potential for lives to be impacted, right? And it was particularly interesting to me to see this picture that showed up on my Twitter feed of a scientist who works in H.J. Andrews experimental forest driving by on the highway and saying, oh my gosh, look at this horrific destruction in H.J. Andrews, right? And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, but the colonizers are already growing back and nobody was hurt by the fire in H.J. Andrews. In fact, for people who have long-term experiments in H.J. Andrews, this is a fascinating once in a lifetime opportunity to look at how this highly infrequent fire event shapes this forest, right? So trying to think about, okay, is this really a disaster or can we turn it into an opportunity scientifically and understand that the forest has regeneration capacity as evidenced by the green already coming up on this site, right? And for California, I've been talking a lot about this in California, looking at each fire and saying, okay, yes, there were a lot of bad outcomes, right? A lot of structures destroyed. This is the Creek Fire that burned about a half an hour from my house here in Fresno, California, had major negative impacts, particularly in terms of a couple of small towns that burned and in the air quality impacts to the Central Valley of California, which already has some of the worst air quality in the country, right? And the Creek Fire burned in an area that had already been heavily impacted by the 2012 to 2017 drought in California. So there's real concern about permanent conifer forest lost over huge areas of this fire. But when we looked at the maps of the Creek Fire, we're talking about a really large fire, and yet over half of it either was unburned within the perimeter, so those fire refugia, or it burned at low severity, right? And the tendency from the media and from the people who are impacted is is they're looking at where their homes were lost. They're looking at these red areas of high severity on this map, right? And obviously that's where the negative impacts were, right? But huge areas of this this fire were also really positive, what we think of as good fire, right? And large areas of it are areas that, you know, had not seen fire in over a century. And again, it's a low fire return interval. So they needed fire. It had been essentially removed from this landscape and they needed it, right? And this fire was 96% outside the WUI. And what was really interesting to watch was that some of the most severe fire effects and severe fire behavior happened down here on the southern end in the town of Shaver Lake, which sits on this Shaver Lake Reservoir, which is a hydropower reservoir for Southern California Edison, which is a major utility in Southern California. SoCal Edison has about 20,000 acres of forest around this lake that they manage. And for, I don't know, 4 or 5 decades, they have been thinning the forest and doing prescribed burning on that property. The Forest Service next door, absolutely disaster, not a resilient forest, burned at high severity, looks like the nuked landscape. But in the Southern California Edison forest, they basically had the fire drop down, low surface fire, wonderful fire effects. It's going to return nutrients to the soil. It protected the lake, protected the hydropower and the water source for the city of Shaver Lake. And it actually saved the town of Shaver Lake because they used that Southern California Edison property as a fuel break to initiate back burns and protect the town from the fire, right? So despite the disastrous outcomes of the Creek Fire, there were also some really positive outcomes on the Creek Fire, right? So we had houses that burned down, absolutely. But we had fire adapted species that 3 weeks after a fire, no rain, not even enough moisture in the air for dew to form yet, right? This is mid-October, about 3 weeks after the southern part, the northern part of the fire was still burning. And this is an oak tree coming back because black oak is fire resilient in this landscape. And we had areas, again, that when they had been treated, when they had been thinned out, right, we had low severity fire. It did exactly what it's supposed to do, which is kill those lower strata trees, and the overstory canopy remained intact, right? Elsewhere in California, people freaked out because the redwoods burned this summer. But guess what? What people don't remember, because redwoods burn so infrequently, is that they are fire adapted resprouters. They actually have endocormic resprout capabilities from their bark, or epicormic, I'm sorry, epicormic resprout from their bark. And, you know, they'll come back nicely. This is not the ones that burn this summer. This is a little bit south of there, but within a few years, and they're already starting to see these epicormic buds sprouting out. These redwoods, most of them will survive, right? On the other side, the giant sequoia in the Sierra Nevada don't do well with high severity fire. They do not have resprouting capability. They depend on low intensity surface fire. So hundreds of giant sequoia were killed in the SQF complex in the southern Sierra Nevada, right? And that is absolutely a disastrous outcome in a landscape that actually needed a lot of fire, but this is a disastrous outcome within that landscape because these guys are gone. You know, 2,000 to 3,000 year old trees. We'll never see them grow back again in our lifetimes. And then finally, this really large August complex, right? This is this gigafire, not technically correct, but you know, this was a huge event because when you cross 1 million acres, people's brains are triggered to, oh my God, that's a huge number. But what's fascinating is that there was only one fatality on the August complex. It was a firefighter. And there were over 900 structures burned. Nearly all of them were in the wildland urban interface at the north end of the fire in this little town that was impacted, right? And realistically on this fire, only 0.3% of it was the wildland urban interface, right? And this was a huge tract of land that had not burned in a century. And when we looked at the fire history for this, right, there had been a few fires in the last century, but the vast majority of it, 82%, this was first fire after a century of fire exclusion. And, you know, what I started talking to some of the Mendocino forest folks about and trying to wrap my brain around is, okay, if we have 800,000 acres, right? That was first fire, and that they have been trying to figure out how to get prescribed fire in for a really long time, or managed wildfire, because there are two huge wildernesses at the north end of this fire and in the central part of this fire. you know, if even half of that burned at low severity or fire refugia, right, unburned, let's say that we had 400,000 hectares of fire treating a landscape that needed fire. And this fire, with the suppression costs of it, you know, the number that I calculated out was, well, instead of saying the whole thing was a disaster, can we say that we had some disastrous outcomes in a little town on the north end, and in some of the ecological areas, and the rest of it, we got the bargain price of $800 a hectare of fire treatment in a place where they couldn't do prescribed fires because it was so difficult to get it passed from the regulatory standpoint. I realize it's a hard thing to wrap your head around, to say, oh, no, this, you know, how could we say this was treatment, right? But that's what managed wildfire is. It is treatment, and acknowledging that, you know, that there is some good that comes out of this, that they were able to do this, they were able to introduce fire in this landscape for a relatively low price, far cheaper than they could ever do prescribed fire, right? And that it was a natural process. That starts to allow us to differentiate between the catastrophic part that we want to mitigate and the natural process that we want to monitor and manage and think about how we can address it going forward through forest management. Okay, so what am I trying to get at here? We have this obsession with size. We need to stop having an obsession with fire size, right? And there's a lot of other things that we can and should measure. It's hard to measure some of them, right? Because the reason we measure area burned is because it's easy. We just draw a perimeter, and we calculate the area in that perimeter, and it's immediate, right? As soon as the fire's done, in fact, on a daily basis during the fire, we're measuring area. So it's easy. Right? There are other things that are really easy to measure. Fatalities are easy, homes burned are easy, suppression costs are easy, right? Hazardous air quality days, that's even pretty easy, you know, but that's not the full story. And there's a lot of other types of measurements that we need to be making, both positive and negative, so that we are able to look at these heterogeneous fire impacts and say, okay, this is fine, and this part is not so good. We need to figure out how to mitigate that, right? So there's a lot of things that are either more difficult to measure, and we have to figure out how to do it through working in cross-disciplinary teams of people, or we have to set up long-term ways of measuring and monitoring these things so that as this land is regenerating and recovering, we can measure that resilience, or those long-term negative impacts to understand what those are and mitigate them. Right? So we need to stop seeing polygons, and maybe the goal here is that we need to stop having maps that look like this, and we start seeing outcomes, right? Where do we see restorative fire? Where do we see things that are negative that we want to mitigate? And we need to stop placing those in fire polygons, right? So that we can get these points across that, yeah, the things we want to mitigate are the bad outcomes, and the good outcomes, the restorative fire, we want to keep maintaining that, right? And there are attempts to do this. This is from Headwaters Economics over in Bozeman, Montana, right? They've put together a great tool to look at actual destruction of structures. So that's fantastic. There's resources for this now. You know, we are getting more information about what kind of disastrous outcomes occurred in California this year. One of the chief ones that was that there was no recreating in national forests for several weeks in September during the middle of the pandemic because all 18 California national forests closed. That obviously has massive tourism dollar impacts to the little towns that depend on it, right? But there was also a lot of positive impacts that I've talked about it, right? And my rough estimate is that about 50%, or 2 million hectares, of the fire that burned in the US in 2020 burned consistent with historic fire regimes, right? So yeah, 4 million hectares burned, but at least 50% of that was not bad. It was not a disastrous outcome. It was fire that was within the historic range, right? And we need to start delineating that and bringing that message along with the disastrous part, okay? Because our goal is to live with fire. And this is a figure from a paper I published with Dave Bowman and company last year about how we actually do this. We talk about, as fire ecologists and fire scientists, we need to learn to live with fire. To facilitate living with fire, we have to acknowledge what that means and what the difference is between disastrous outcomes that we want to mitigate and positive outcomes where fire does the ecosystem process that it has done for centuries, right? The work in these ecosystems that is done for millennia. Okay, so take home message, size doesn't matter. It's easy to measure, right? And if it did matter, we would actually applaud more fire because it restores historical fire regimes, right? But we know that there's a lot of disasters. So that's why we struggle with this, right? A single fire has both positive and negative effects. And as ecologists, as foresters, right, we know that heterogeneity and complexity are codependent. We have to recognize that in the way that we measure and talk about fire. And we really want to stop trying to prevent fires and instead focus on mitigating negative impacts. And my vote for the new Smokey the Bear motto, or Smokey Bear, I think is what the official name is only you can prevent wildfire disasters, right? Because that's what we really want to try and prevent. And with that, I will finish up. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for that excellent presentation. We can take questions in the chat if anyone has questions they'd like to ask Crystal. Yeah, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask, or throw it in the chat. Either way is fine.
Stunned everyone into silence.
Yeah, you can also raise your hand if you need, and we can unmute you for questions. Oh, I see. You can't unmute. Yes, that would be the issue.
Hi, everybody. So if you just raise your hand, we will unmute you to ask your question. We have that power, but just for Zoom safety, it's turned off right now.
So I see a question from David Shaw. How do we deal with the fire deficit? Is there something that we should be doing? Yeah, that's a great question, David. And you know, the fire deficit is one of the reasons why I have been trying to break down these really large fires, right? Because ideally, in a perfect world, we would have several years without large wildfires where we could go in and do huge amounts of forest thinning and removing the small diameter stuff that's making all those dog hair thickets, and you know, removing all the down and dead, and then just running lots of prescribed fire and restoring the system, right? That would be ideal. That's not what's happening, right? Because thanks to climate change, we've got almost every year. I mean, you know, my husband's a climatologist, and they're fielding questions left to right about how bad this fire year is going to be, because again, we're dry and hot, and we've already got fires burning in California, you know, earlier in the year than normal. So what can we do? Well, we can ramp up a lot of prescribed fire as much as we can. That is hard. It takes time because everything has to go through NEPA. So that is, you know, that is trying to support prescribed fire and forest thinning practices that restore those lower densities and restore forest resilience. That's one tactic. But then the other thing that a lot of us can do that work on this type of science is talk about the positives that we see in these fires. And particularly, I want to share a quick story about the Creek Fire. You know, so they were doing daily briefings on Facebook that I got to watch every day. And one of the things that I saw, as a former firefighter, I know full well what they were doing on the most eastern edge of that fire was that they were really minimizing the attempts to suppress on that edge, right? Because it wasn't safe for firefighters. That's where we have fatalities from firefighters. And it was running into the wilderness, and it was running into that Sierra granite that basically they knew the fire was going to go out as soon as it got into this area. But they couldn't say that, right? The fire professionals, the ICT, or the incident command team, they couldn't say, oh, you know, we're just letting it burn naturally on the east side, because there would have been enormous political ramifications and public backlash, right? So I started talking about this, saying, yeah, you know what, on the east side, the fire's actually doing really good work, and we should support letting it burn on the east side until it goes out naturally, whether that's because it hits the rocks or the snow falls, you know, and have it function like a managed wildfire, right? So that it is doing the good work. And that's where our role as scientists, highlighting the things that fire professionals can't say because politically it would destroy them, right? Highlighting those things and being willing to sort of point out scientifically, yes, this is supported up here, right? So it's supported because we don't want to kill firefighters. They're not protecting houses. They're not doing anything up there. And the fire is actually doing good work, right? To help people start thinking that all fire is not bad, right? Bambi and Smokey Bear have done their job over the decades, and the public still struggles enormously. They know fire is supposed to be good, but they also don't want to see smoke. They don't want to see fire, right? And so part of what our goal is as scientists is to say, yeah, okay, we know this is a struggle, but here's what the science says that supports this action, or here's the reality about smoke. We're going to have it, right? And we can either have it through managed wildfire or prescribed fire, or you're going to get it in huge doses when you don't want it in August and September. So, great question.
Looks like we have another question in the chat. It says, can we start a website like Headwater Economics? One monitoring disasters outcomes, but focusing on the benefits of fire. And that's from Chris Adlam.
Yeah, Chris, let's talk about that, because that is something that Kimmy Barrett at Headwaters and I have talked about, and would be this is something that is, you know, one of the things we don't have is a national prescribed fire database, right? It's even hard if you want to figure out how much managed wildfire is happening every year. It's hard. You have to go in and pick it out individually in the SIT reports, right? So it's even hard to pick out sort of where there's good fire happening in terms of data sets. So some of those first steps are things that, yes, there are a lot of folks like myself that are pushing for this, and getting support and getting funding for those is something that we want to do more of, right? Oh, and Tom's question about carbon. Okay, is there a lesson here regarding fire forests and the permanence of forest carbon when people are considering carbon offsets that trade forest carbon for fossil fuel carbon? Yeah, so this is obviously a huge issue in California because we have a cap and trade program. Like, we have a whole carbon monitoring program that forests are involved in, right? And so this has been a huge challenge to try and I will say that the California Air Resources Board, which runs the carbon accounting program, they have hired quite a few forestry folks and forest scientists that can really understand the nuance of this. So they're getting better about it, you know, and the challenge is in many ways getting industry and science to talk the same language, right? Because there are certain folks in the industry that say, okay, well, we should just cut down all the trees now before they burn and put them in the houses, right? And then the carbon will be stored, right? But if only it were that simple, right? And so the thing that I think is really important is that we have models, right? We have models that are capable of looking at those long-term impacts, and we really need to work on improving those models so that for every hectare that burns, right, we should be able to put every hectare that burns in a given year into one of these models and say, okay, actually, this is going to, not right away it's a carbon source, but in 10 years, it'll be a sink again, and we'll actually be sequestering more carbon than we were before, right? And this is in a 10 to 50 to 100 year time frame, which is really where we need to be looking for carbon, right? We need to be accounting for every hectare or every acre as a net carbon positive over a long-term impact versus a short-term impact, right? And that is a challenge because the models are still evolving, but we do have the capacity, and thankfully there's interest in California in trying to do that.
Thanks, Crystal. I think that's all the time we have for questions at the moment, because we have those two concurrent sessions that are starting up. So one in room A and one in room B, and you can find the schedule of presenters on the WFGR's website, as well as the links to those sessions. So thanks, Crystal. We can give you a hand, a virtual hand for your awesome presentation.
Thank
Yeah,
you all so
I-
much for having me. It was my pleasure. And if you're interested in this discussion and ongoing having it, please feel free to email me, because this is a building discussion that a lot of folks are getting interested in now. So.
Thank you, Crystal. So Crystal and everyone else, I'm gonna actually have to close this Zoom room so that everyone gets kicked back to the main conference page. And then some folks will come back into the Zoom room for the next concurrent session. But that was a great talk. Thank you so much for being here.